On May 10, 1994, Nelson Mandela stood before the world as South Africa's first black president, marking the end of apartheid and the birth of what many called the Rainbow Nation. 30 years later, that same nation finds itself drowning in corruption scandals, with billions stolen from public coffers and democratic institutions crumbling under the weight of systematic looting. This is the story of how South Africa went from the miracle of peaceful transition to becoming one of the most corrupt countries on earth. If you think corruption is just about politicians getting rich, you're missing the bigger picture. The numbers are staggering. Between 2014 and 2017 alone, state capture cost South Africa an estimated 250 billion rand. That's $17 billion. To put that in perspective, that's enough money to build 500 new hospitals or provide free university education for every South African student for the next decade. But the money didn't just disappear into thin air. It was systematically stolen through one of the most sophisticated corruption networks in modern democratic history. But here's what makes this story truly shocking. The corruption didn't start after apartheid ended. It was baked into the system from day one. The very foundations that were supposed to support South Africa's new democracy became the tools for its destruction. By the end of this video, you'll understand exactly how a country that inspired the world with its peaceful transition became a cautionary tale of how corruption can destroy a nation from within. Before we dive into the corruption scandals that would make international headlines, we need to understand what South Africa inherited from apartheid. The apartheid system wasn't just about racial segregation. It was a masterclass in institutional corruption and rent-seeking that lasted from 1948 to the early 1990s. The white minority government had perfected the art of using state resources for political gain. Under apartheid, the civil service was essentially a giant patronage network. Afrikaner businesses got government contracts, not because they were the best bidders, but because of their political connections. Government jobs were handed out based on loyalty rather than merit. Sound familiar? This wasn't a bug in the system. It was a feature. The apartheid government understood that controlling resources meant controlling power. But here's where it gets really interesting. In the 1980s, as international pressure mounted and the apartheid system began to crack, the government created something called the Homeland States. These were supposedly independent territories for black South Africans, but in reality, they were perfect laboratories for corruption. Homeland leaders presided over massive networks of patronage, using government resources to buy loyalty and maintain control. The infrastructure for systematic corruption was already in place. When apartheid ended in 1994, South Africa didn't just inherit racial inequality. It inherited an entire system designed around using state power for personal enrichment. The new African National Congress government promised to dismantle these corrupt practices, but instead, many simply changed the beneficiaries. The transition negotiations between 1990 and 1993 were hailed as a miracle of peaceful compromise. But what many observers missed was what didn't change. The same bureaucratic structures remained in place. The same state-owned enterprises continued operating. The same procurement systems that had enriched white businesses under apartheid were now available to new political elites. Jacob Zuma understood this better than most. When he became president in 2009, he didn't just stumble into corruption. He had a plan. Within a month of taking office, evidence shows Zuma was already working to capture Transnet, one of South Africa's largest state-owned companies. By November 2010, he had implemented a systematic strategy that would make the apartheid-era's corruption look amateur by comparison. The key was the Gupta family. These wealthy Indian businessmen didn't just buy influence, they bought the entire state. They understood that in South Africa's system of state-owned enterprises, whoever controlled the boards controlled the money. And there was a lot of money to control. Eskom, the electricity monopoly. Transnet, the transport giant. South African Airways. Denel, the arms manufacturer. These weren't just companies, they were the commanding heights of the South African economy. The Gupta's strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. First, get close to Zuma. They funded his children's weddings, gave them jobs, bought them apartments in Dubai. Then, systematically replace the boards of state-owned enterprises with loyalists. Install Gupta allies as chairman of tender committees. Remove any ministers or officials who posed obstacles. The National Prosecution Agency, the police, the Revenue Service, all were compromised. But the real genius was in the execution. This wasn't crude bribery with suitcases full of cash. The Guptas created an entire ecosystem of corruption. Government contracts were awarded to shell companies that would then subcontract the actual work to legitimate businesses, taking massive cuts in the process. Procurement processes were rigged from the inside. Even the timing of tender announcements was coordinated to benefit Gupta-linked companies. The scale was breathtaking. State-owned enterprises that should have been driving economic growth were instead being systematically looted. Eskom, which provides 95% of South Africa's electricity, was forced to buy coal from Gupta companies at prices well above market rates. The money that should have gone to maintaining power stations instead went to funding private jets and luxury lifestyles. The consequences were immediate and devastating. By 2014, South Africa was experiencing rolling blackouts that would cripple the economy for years to come. Businesses couldn't operate when the lights went out unpredictably. Mines shut down. Factories closed. The country that had been Africa's economic powerhouse was literally being plunged into darkness by corruption. But the Guptas weren't content with just energy. They set their sights on Transnet, the massive freight and logistics company that moves goods across the continent. Here, they pulled off perhaps their most audacious scheme yet. Transnet needed new locomotives to modernize its aging fleet. What should have been a straightforward procurement process became a masterclass in state capture. The tender was rigged from the start. Gupta-linked companies were given advance information about the specifications. Competing bidders found themselves mysteriously disqualified on technicalities. When the dust settled, contracts worth billions had been awarded to Chinese manufacturers represented by Gupta intermediaries. But here's the kicker. The locomotives were overpriced by an estimated 30%, and many didn't even meet South African railway standards. The human cost of this systematic looting cannot be overstated. Every rand stolen from state-owned enterprises was a rand that couldn't be spent on schools, hospitals or housing for the millions of South Africans still living in poverty. The unemployment rate, already catastrophically high, continued to climb as economic growth stagnated. The inequality that apartheid had created was being perpetuated by the very government elected to address it. Meanwhile, the Guptas were living like royalty. Private jets, luxury compounds, shopping sprees that would make oligarchs blush. But their most brazen display of power came in 2013 with a wedding that would shock the nation. When the Gupta family decided to celebrate at Sun City, they didn't just book a venue. They landed a chartered plane carrying over 200 international guests at Waterkloof Air Force Base, a restricted military facility normally reserved for heads of state. The symbolism was impossible to ignore. Here was a private family using South Africa's most secure military installation as their personal airport. Guests were given police escorts with blue lights flashing, as if they were visiting dignitaries rather than wedding guests. The message was clear. The Guptas didn't just have influence, they had captured the state itself. Public outrage was swift and fierce. How had a private family gained access to military facilities? Who had authorized this breach of security protocols? The answers pointed directly to the highest levels of government. Jacob Zuma had tacitly approved the decision, demonstrating just how completely the normal rules no longer applied to his benefactors. The scandal exposed the truth that many had suspected, but few dared to say out loud. South Africa's democracy hadn't been captured overnight. It had been systematically dismantled piece by piece, using the very institutions meant to protect it. From apartheid's patronage networks to the Gupta's state capture, the pattern was clear. When institutions become tools for enrichment rather than service, democracy itself becomes the casualty. Today, as South Africa grapples with the aftermath, one question remains. Can a nation rebuild what corruption has destroyed? Or is this the price of ignoring the warning signs that were there from the very beginning?